The
apartment
apartment
was
already
so
at the
quiet
altar,
that she could
her
hear her
ivory
own
tray.
heartbeat. Mara Linden stood pressed against the bathroom wall, both hands wrapped around her phone, the screen dimmed to its lowest setting so even its faint glow wouldn't show beneath the door. Lily slept in the bedroom at the end of the hall. 4 years old, barely 40 pounds. Curled under the dinosaur blanket she refused to give up for anything, her dark hair fanned across the pillow, her small chest rising and falling with the deep, even rhythm of a child who still believed that sleep was always safe. She didn't know, and Mara was going to keep it that way. The sound had come from the fire escape. 10 minutes ago, 3 sharp footsteps that paused directly outside the kitchen window, followed by a stillness more frightening than noise. Before that, the buzzer. 3 long presses in a row, not a mistake, not a delivery driver, not a neighbor who had forgotten their key. Mara had learned to read Derek Sable in the years she had spent trying to survive him, and she knew exactly what 3 long presses meant. It meant he had found her. It meant the 7 months she had spent building a quiet, invisible life in this city had run out. It meant that tonight was the night she had been dreading since the moment she stepped onto the bus that brought her here with $200 in cash and her daughter asleep against her shoulder. Mara's thumb moved across the phone screen, pulling up her recent contacts, looking for Doreen, 2 floors up, whose son Marcus worked private security and who kept a pit bull named Captain that had never once in his life slept through a full night. She found what she thought was the right number and pressed call. If you're already caught up in this story, hit that like button and subscribe. It takes 2 seconds and it means the world to me. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get back to them. The line rang once, twice. On the 3rd ring, a voice answered. Not Doreen, not Marcus. A male voice, low and completely unhurried, carrying the particular quality of someone who was never startled by anything, who had answered enough late-night calls about enough dangerous things that the hour and the tension in a stranger's breathing registered as information rather than alarm. Yes. Not hello. Just yes. One word, stripped of everything unnecessary, offered without warmth or pretense, as if even ordinary greetings were something this man had decided years ago he didn't know anyone. Mara recognized, somewhere beneath the panic thundering through her, that she had dialed wrong. Her fingers had slipped in the dark. She was connected to a stranger on the worst night of a year already full of terrible nights, and the rational part of her brain, the part that had kept her alive and moving for 7 months, was telling her to hang up immediately and dial again correctly. Then the sound came from the other side of the apartment door. Not a knock, not the buzzer. The faint, deliberate scrape of something metal testing the lock cylinder. Slow, almost gentle. The sound of someone who understood that patience accomplished what force could not, at least not at first, at least not while he was still deciding how he wanted this to go. He's outside my door. She didn't plan to say it. The words slipped out the way things do when fear strips away every filter between your thoughts and your voice. Barely a sound, barely even breath. Please. He's outside my door. He found me. A pause on the other end. Not the empty pause of someone confused or about to hang up, but the pause of someone absorbing information with complete precision, cataloging it, deciding what it required. Then, what's your address? She almost didn't answer. Giving her address to an unknown man in the middle of the night, while an ex-boyfriend tested her lock from the outside, every instinct honed from 7 months of survival was screaming at her to hang up and call 911 instead. But she had already made that call once before, back in the city she had fled, back when she still believed that reporting things through proper channels would keep her safe. The police had come, and they had taken a statement, and they had explained gently that what Derek had done didn't technically qualify as breaking and entering because he still had a key, and that the bruise on her wrist could have come from any number of things, and that without clearer evidence of a credible threat, there wasn't much they could do. And then they had left. And Derek had been waiting in the parking lot when she walked to her car the next morning, and he had smiled at her in a way that made it clear the police visit had only clarified something for him. It had clarified that she was on her own. She had been on her own since then. Apartment 4C, she whispered. The Holloway building on Crane Street. Please, I have a 4-year-old daughter. Stay where you are. His voice didn't shift. No urgency, no alarm, no softening of any kind. Just that same absolute, impersonal calm. Don't open the door for anyone who doesn't give you the name Vero first. I'll have someone there in 15 minutes. Who are you? A pause. almost imperceptible. Then, someone you called. The line stayed open. She didn't hear him end it. But within 90 seconds, she caught the faint sound of his voice speaking to someone else, not to her. Words she couldn't fully make out. Low and direct. Her address repeated back once. And then a single instruction she couldn't hear, but which clearly communicated a complete set of expectations. The kind of instruction that only happens when the person giving it has never in their life had to ask twice. Then quiet again on his end. Just the open line. Just the proof that he was still there. Mara pressed her back harder against the bathroom tile and tried to remember how to breathe. She had gotten good at waiting in small, airless spaces. In the years she had spent with Derek Sable, waiting in the bathroom had become something she understood the mechanics of better than she had ever wanted to. The way time moved differently when you were afraid. The way sound became magnified, hyper-real. Every creak and footstep translated into threat assessment in real time. The way your body eventually learned to hold itself completely still, to slow your breathing, to make itself smaller than it actually was. She had not always been this person. She wanted to remember that. There had been a version of Mara Linden who worked the Sunday brunch shift at a nice restaurant downtown and took 2-night classes a semester at the community college and kept sketchbooks full of lettering studies and logo concepts and mock-up layouts that her graphic design instructor had circled in red and written promising in the margin. She had been 23 when she met Derek. Young enough to believe that someone who looked at her with that kind of focused intensity was seeing something worth seeing, rather than something he wanted to own. He had come into the restaurant on a Tuesday in March, alone, ordered the same thing 3 weeks in a row so he'd have a reason to sit in her section, and left a 40% tip with his number written on a cocktail napkin. He was easy confidence and genuine seeming attention, the kind of man who listened when you talked and remembered what you said and showed up where you were. And in the first weeks of knowing him, Mara had thought that being wanted by someone like that meant something good about her own worth. It wasn't until much later that she understood the difference between a man who wanted you and a man who needed to possess you. And by then the distinction had cost her more than she could calculate. It started the way these things always started. She knew that now, had done the reading in the years since, had sat in a shelter waiting room once with a pamphlet in her hands, recognizing her own life in every paragraph, as if someone had written the thing specifically for her. The isolation came first. Small things. Why are you going out tonight? I thought we could stay in. Your friends don't really appreciate you the way I do. Your sister made a comment about you at that dinner last month that I didn't want to bring up, but I think you should know. She had accepted it, had rearranged herself around his needs the way you do when you have been taught that love requires constant accommodation, when bending is something you mistake for generosity. By the time she understood how far she had bent, she was no longer sure she remembered which direction straight was. The first time he hurt her, she had called it an accident. The second time, she had called it a mistake. His mistake. He had cried. He had said things she had needed to hear, had held her hands, and described a future she still wanted to believe in. And she had stayed because leaving requires a clarity of understanding that grief actively prevents, and she had still been grieving the man she thought he was. She would spend years, later, forgiving herself for that delay. She would not entirely succeed. Then she found out she was pregnant. She had expected that to change things, had held some quiet and desperate hope that a child would reach something in him that she apparently couldn't. Instead, the pregnancy had made things worse in ways that were difficult to describe in linear terms. The control intensified, became something that filled every room of her day. The monitoring became constant where she was, who she saw, what she ate, how she spent her hours. The things he said in private, the low, methodical cruelties he delivered without ever raising his voice, had a new quality to them, a finality, as if the pregnancy had settled something for him, had given him a permanent claim she would never be able to argue out of. Lily was born in February on a night when Derek was not there. Mara had gone into labor while he was out and had called her upstairs neighbor instead of him, and the neighbor had driven her to the hospital and held her hand while Lily arrived at 3:47 in the morning, red and furious, and already, somehow, the most important thing Mara had ever seen in her life. She had looked at her daughter in the first minutes after she was born and understood two things simultaneously. The first was that she would die for this child without hesitation. The second was that dying wasn't the answer, that the best thing she could do was live and keep living, and build something worth living inside. Those two understandings had taken root in her chest that night and become the only currency she trusted. The leaving had taken another 14 months. It had required planning in secret, money saved in amounts small enough that he wouldn't notice them missing, documentation gathered over weeks, an exit plan with more holes in it than she would have liked. On a Tuesday in September, while Derek was in a meeting she knew would run long, Mara had packed 2 bags, strapped Lily into her car seat, and driven until the gas tank was low and she found a bus station and bought 2 tickets to a city she had chosen specifically because she had no history there, no connection, nothing Derek could follow. She had left her car in the station lot, walked to the counter, and paid cash. The bus had crossed 3 state lines before dawn. Lily had slept the whole way. Mara had sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the dark landscape move past the window and repeated to herself the only thing she needed to believe, that getting her daughter somewhere safe was the only decision that mattered, and everything else could be built from there. 7 months. She had built something in 7 months that was smaller than anything she had imagined for herself, but it was hers. The diner on Meridian Street where she worked the dinner and closing shifts, where her manager Gloria was a 53-year-old woman who had seen enough of the world to recognize when someone needed not to be asked questions, who paid her in cash when she requested it, and kept her name out of the digital employee roster without comment. The daycare 2 blocks from the diner, run by a woman named Mrs. Huang who watched Lily with a warmth that made Mara feel, on good days, like she had found a small corner of the world that still functioned correctly. The apartment on Crane Street, which was too expensive for what it was, but had a deadbolt and a chain lock and a fire escape she had examined from every angle before she signed the lease, calculating egress routes the way she now calculated everything. She had almost felt safe. Not safe, she was too careful for that word, too aware of what safety actually cost, but something adjacent. Something like the space between 2 locked doors where you could, briefly, stop holding your breath. Then 3 months ago, Derek had found her first address. She had arrived at the diner one morning to find him sitting at the counter, coffee in front of him, watching the door with a patience that made her stomach turn over. She had walked past without stopping, had gone directly to Mrs. Huang's, had scooped up Lily mid-morning snack, and had spent 6 days in a motel on the edge of the city before she found a new apartment and moved everything she owned in the back of a borrowed truck. She had been more careful after that, changed her route to work every few days, stopped using any card with her name on it, told no one, not Gloria, not Doreen, not Mrs. Huang, where she was living. Somehow, he had found her again. The metallic testing of the lock had stopped while she was running through all of this, and the new silence was worse. Mara pressed the phone harder against her ear. The line was still open. The stranger was still there. She could feel the particular weight of someone present on the other end, the subtle change in ambience that meant a person was listening, waiting, accounting for time. He stopped, she breathed. I know. 2 words. As if he had access to information she didn't have about her own hallway. How was that possible in under 10 minutes? She filed the question in the back of her mind and focused on the immediate reality. Lily was still asleep. The lock had not turned. The bathroom door was locked from the inside, and the window above the toilet was too small for anyone to use as an entry point. She counted seconds. Time did its strange, elastic distortion under fear, expanding and compressing in ways that made it impossible to measure accurately. She thought it had been about 12 minutes since she'd placed the call. Maybe 13. Then she heard other sounds from the direction of the hallway. Sounds that were different from what came before. The elevator arriving. Footsteps. More than one person. Voices, not raised voices. Not anything that carried the particular energy of confrontation, but a low, controlled exchange that she couldn't parse through the walls and the ambient noise of the building. What she could parse was the change in Derek's voice when he responded to whoever was now in the hallway with him. She recognized that change. She had heard it once before, at a party years ago, when a man had said something to Derek that made him recalibrate entirely, his voice dropping from confident to something that could be mistaken for respectful, but was actually just very, very careful. Derek was afraid of whoever was in the hallway. The exchange lasted perhaps 90 seconds. Then nothing. A knock on her door. Measured. 3 even beats. Vero. A different voice from the one on the phone. Younger, with a slight accent she couldn't place. He's gone, Ms. Linden. You can open the door. Mara's hand tightened around the phone. She hadn't given the man on the phone her last name. She stood in the bathroom for another long moment, running through everything she knew and everything she didn't know. Then she unlocked the bathroom door and walked down the hallway, one hand on the wall for steadiness, and put her eye to the peephole. Two men stood in the corridor, both of them large in the way that came from deliberate maintenance rather than accident, carrying themselves with the relaxed stillness of people who were never surprised by what came through doors because they had already decided what they would do if it did. One of them she didn't recognize, dark jacket, close-cropped hair, hands at his sides in a way that communicated both absolute stillness and the readiness to stop being still. The other one was not looking at her door at all. He was standing slightly behind and to the left, hands in the pockets of a dark coat, gaze moving along the hallway with the unhurried, reflexive quality of someone cataloging a space out of habit rather than necessity. She looked at that second man longer. He was tall, not oversized, not the kind of large that announced itself, but tall in the way that made him the dominant presence in any space without any particular effort on his part. Dark hair, sharp angles to his face in the fisheye distortion of the peephole. He looked like someone who had decided a long time ago that the world would arrange itself around him and had since stopped noticing when it did. Mara unbolted the door and opened it 6 inches. The chain held. The first man looked at her through the gap with an expression that carried no warmth, but no threat either. "He's gone for tonight," he said. "My employer would like a moment of your time." "Who is your employer?" The man glanced to his left. The taller one had not moved, had not turned to face the door. He was still looking down the hallway at an angle, as if this conversation were occurring slightly beneath his concern. Then he turned and looked at her through the 6-inch gap with eyes that were the gray of deep water in winter, the particular gray that tells you nothing about what exists underneath. "You called me," he said. His voice was exactly what she had heard on the phone. "Open the door." Mara heard something inside her chest respond to that voice in a way she didn't entirely understand, not fear, though fear was present too, moving through everything like background static. Something else. The instinctive recognition, developed over years of learning to read situations accurately in order to survive them, that whatever this man represented, it was not the thing she had spent the last several years learning to endure. He didn't have Derek's quality, that coiled, searching energy of aggression looking for permission. This was something categorically different. What that difference was, she couldn't have named yet. She closed the door, slid off the chain, and opened it fully. He walked in the way people move when they have spent so many years as the most consequential person in any room they enter that they have entirely forgotten to perform confidence, because confidence has become invisible to them, just the default state of the world. Not aggression, not dominance as a display. Simply the way a man moves when he has never questioned his right to be somewhere. He crossed into the living room and stood there a moment, taking it in. The second-hand couch with the throw blanket Lily used for movie nights. The small kitchen where the coupon organizer sat on the counter next to the 2-burner stove, organized with rubber bands by category, because it was the only financial system Mara could afford, and she maintained it with the discipline of someone who understood exactly what happened when the margins got any thinner. The child's artwork held to the refrigerator door with magnets, shaped like fruit: a green apple, a yellow banana, a strawberry missing one of its seeds. Lily's drawings. Scribbled suns and lopsided figures, and a horse that looked more like a very optimistic cloud. The single lamp left on in the living room because Lily sometimes woke in the night and needed to see light under her door to know the world had not gone dark. He looked at all of it, not with judgment, not with the particular, condescending assessment of a wealthy person cataloging scarcity, just with the complete, impersonal attention of someone who was gathering information and had not yet decided what to do with it. "Roman Valcourt," he said, his back still partially to her. "You dialed the wrong number." "I know." Mara crossed her arms over her chest in old habit, a compression she had developed over years of conversations where she needed to take up less space than she actually occupied. "You answered anyway." "I always answer." He turned to look at her, and she was struck again by the quality of his attention, not the scanning, measuring, weakness cataloging assessment she had learned to flinch from. Something more impersonal than that, the same attention a man might give to a problem he was deciding how to approach. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a card. Matt White, a name and a phone number embossed in black. He set it on the counter between them rather than handing it to her. The man outside. Tell me about him. You should tell me who you are first. Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement. More like the acknowledgement that the response had been a reasonable one and he had registered it as such. Tell me about the man outside, he said again. Mara looked at the card, then at him. She had spent years developing the skill of reading the difference between a man who represented danger and a man who did not had honed it the way you hone things when your survival depends on accuracy. She was not operating from complete information here. She knew essentially nothing about Roman Valcourt, including why a man who had been responded to a wrong number call by sending what were clearly not ordinary security personnel to her door at midnight. None of it was normal. None of it should have made her feel any safer. But the quality of his stillness, the specific absence of agitation in it, the complete lack of the predatory searching energy she had learned to flinch away from told her that whatever this man's presence in her apartment meant, he was not the thing she needed to be afraid of tonight. His name is Derek Sable, she said. My ex. I left him 14 months ago. He's found me twice now. This is the second time. Valcourt hadn't moved. He listened the way people with genuine power listened without needing to signal that they were listening, without filling the space with affirmation, simply absorbing what was said and processing it behind eyes that gave away nothing at all. How old is your daughter? 4. She's asleep. Mara tilted her head toward the hallway. Her name is Lily. He knows about her. Not a question. She answered it anyway. Yes. Has he made direct threats about her? He makes implications. She stopped. Started again. He never says things directly. He's careful about that. He understands exactly where the line is, and he stays just on the right side of it, so there's nothing the police can do. The words came out flat, without bitterness, the particular flatness of someone who has processed a thing so many times that the emotion has been worn smooth. He's been doing it for years. Valcourt nodded once. It was a minimal motion, barely perceptible, but it contained a complete understanding of what she had just described, the particular carefulness of a man who knew where the legal lines were and used them as a tool rather than respecting them as a boundary. Mama. The voice came from the hallway doorway. Small. Sleep thickened, carrying the specific confusion of a 4-year-old who has woken to find the world slightly rearranged from how she left it. Mara turned immediately. Lily stood in the hallway entrance in her star-print pajamas, slightly too small now across the shoulders, holding George the stuffed rabbit by one ear, her dark hair a tangle from sleep, her eyes moving around the living room with the slow, deliberate blink of someone not entirely awake yet. She took in the lamp, the couch, her mother, and then the man in the dark coat standing in the middle of the room, and she stared at him with the complete, unself-conscious directness that belonged only to small children and people who had stopped caring what anyone thought. You're tall, she informed him. Mara felt the strange, almost absurd quality of the moment settle over her. The midnight apartment, the wrong number, the most expensive coat she had ever seen standing in her living room, and her daughter's forensic social observation. She risked a glance at Valcourt. Something had changed in his expression. It was minimal, the kind of change invisible to someone not already watching carefully. But Mara had spent years developing exactly that skill, the ability to read the information people hadn't meant to give away, and she saw it. Something had shifted, very briefly, in the way he looked at Lily. Not warmth, she couldn't call it that. Not from a man who radiated something this fundamentally cold in every other direction. But a different kind of stillness. A quieter kind. As if something in the room had required him to briefly recalculate. Yes, he said to Lily. The word was even, direct, without the slightly theatrical quality that adults usually brought to speaking to small children that performed gentleness, that slight pitch adjustment. Just an honest answer. Lily considered this. Then, my rabbit's name is George. Lily. Mara turned her daughter gently back toward the hallway. Back to bed. I'll come tuck you in 1 minute. Will the tall man still be here? Go back to bed, sweetheart. Lily went, dragging George by one ear, only partially convinced, her small feet padding back down the hallway to the creak of the bedroom door and the soft settling of weight back onto the mattress. When Mara turned around, Valcourt was looking at her again with the same neutral quality as before. But something in the room had shifted in the last 60 seconds in a way she couldn't entirely quantify, some small rearrangement of the air. She's safe here tonight, he said. I'll leave someone on the building. You don't have to, I know. He was already moving toward the door with the same economy of motion as everything else he did. The man outside. Sable. He has a connection to Hector Dean's operation in the South Quarter. Mara didn't know who Hector Dean was, but from the way Valcourt said the name flat, identified, without any particular weight placed on it. In the way you say the name of something that is simply a fact to be addressed, she understood the information was significant and that he was sharing it not as a kindness, but as a partial explanation. What does that mean? She asked. He looked at her for one moment more, with those winter gray eyes that gave away less than any eyes she had ever looked into. It means the call wasn't accidental, he said. Wrong number or not. Then he was gone. The door closed behind him with a sound, so controlled it barely registered as a sound at all. Mara stood in the middle of her living room for 30 seconds, listening to the building settle around her, listening to the quality of the quiet that had replaced the terrible held-breath tension of before. It was a different kind of quiet now. Not safe, she was too careful for that word, too experienced in what safety actually required. But different, more spacious, as if the walls had moved slightly outward. She picked up his card from the counter. Roman Valcourt. A phone number. Nothing else. She set it down and went to tuck in her daughter. The following morning came gray and cool, an October morning that smelled like wet leaves and the approaching cold of something that was not yet winter but had made up its mind to get there. Mara walked Lily to Mrs. Huang's at 7:15, holding her daughter's hand across 3 intersections, watching the street in both directions the way she always did, cataloging unfamiliar cars and faces as a matter of habit now, the way other people checked their phones. Lily chattered about a dream involving George the rabbit and a talking train that could also fly, and Mara listened with one part of her attention and kept the rest scanning. She didn't see Derek. She did, however, notice the dark sedan parked across from the daycare entrance. She could not have explained immediately why it registered. It was an ordinary car, nothing distinctive, no particular reason to flag it. But it sat in a position that offered clear sight lines to both the daycare entrance and the street Mara would walk back down. And the man behind the wheel was looking at his phone with the precise quality of inattentiveness that someone actually looking at their phone would not produce. She filed it without comment and kept walking. The apartment felt smaller than usual after she dropped off Lily, the walls closer, the chain bolt insufficient in a way it hadn't felt before Derek had stood outside her door last night. She sat at the small table with a cup of coffee she didn't drink and the card from Valcourt on the surface in front of her. Roman Valcourt. She had looked the name up on her phone at 5 in the morning when she couldn't sleep, scrolling through search results that gave her fragments and implications rather than facts, business associations that led to other associations, news articles that mentioned his name in proximity to investigations that went nowhere. A photograph from a charity event 6 years ago that showed a man in a dark suit standing slightly apart from the other attendees as if attendance had been a professional obligation rather than something he'd chosen. The photograph was not entirely informative, but it confirmed the basic shape of what she had understood when she opened her door last night. Roman Valcourt was a man who operated in the spaces between the official and the unofficial, between what was legal and what was simply never investigated. She had grown up in a family that understood those spaces existed, had heard enough of the right conversations in the right waiting rooms over the past 7 months to have a working vocabulary for what she was looking at. He was someone the city's legitimate infrastructure left alone because leaving him alone was simpler than the alternative. She had called him by accident. He had come anyway. The diner opened at 6 and her shift started at 11, which gave her 3 hours to do nothing but think, which was the worst possible use of 3 hours. She spent them moving through the apartment with the restless, non-directional energy of someone whose threat assessment system had been running at full capacity for 12 hours without finding a safe place to discharge. She straightened Lily's room, reorganized the kitchen cabinets, stood at the window for long stretches watching the street below with the focused blankness of someone who had made alertness into a resting state. The man in the dark sedan was still there when she left for work. She walked the 2 blocks to the diner with her hands in her jacket pockets and her shoulders slightly forward and her eyes on the pavement in front of her the way she moved when she needed to not be looked at. The city was doing what cities do in the cold morning, moving, generating its ordinary noise, filling the air with the smell of exhaust and coffee from the open door of the place 2 doors down from the diner. None of it seemed to notice her. None of it seemed to be watching. Gloria was behind the counter when Mara came in, reading glasses on, inventory sheets spread across the laminate, the coffee running already and filling the whole space with the particular warmth of a kitchen that had been going since before dawn. She looked up when Mara pushed through the door. "You look like you ran here," Gloria said. "Just cold." Mara tied her apron and started on the napkin dispensers. "The night okay?" There were things Mara told Gloria because she trusted her, and things she protected her from because she didn't want anyone else inside the perimeter of her problems. Gloria was 63 and had 2 grandchildren and had never once asked Mara anything she didn't offer first, which was its own form of care. "Fine," she said. "Didn't sleep well." Gloria watched her for one long, experienced beat over the reading glasses, the look of a woman who had seen several lifetimes' worth of people not saying what they meant, and then returned to the inventory sheets. The morning moved through its rhythms. Regulars came in for coffee and eggs before work, the woman from the tax office in the corner with her fruit plate and her novel, the retired teacher by the window who left a $2 tip and a different compliment every single Tuesday. Mara moved through her section with the efficient warmth she had developed over years in this work, present and attentive without being performing, able to make people feel noticed without requiring anything from them in return. It was a skill she had built in her own emotional lean years, and it served her well in a diner. At 11:47, a man she had never seen before came in and took the last booth in her section. He was ordinary looking in the deliberate way that was itself a form of camouflage, the kind of face and body language that communicated nothing and therefore passed without notice in the way that remarkable things never could. He ordered black coffee. He did not open a phone or a book or a newspaper. He sat at an angle that gave him a clear view of the street through the window and of the diner's front door, and he remained precisely at that angle without moving for 1 hour and 14 minutes, at which point he ordered a second coffee and continued sitting. Mara refilled his cup and looked at him directly. He looked back at her with the blank, pleasantly neutral expression of a man with absolutely nothing to communicate. And she thought, "You work for him." She said nothing, went back to her other tables. But something in the awareness of it, of being watched over, of someone having been placed specifically in this space because of her, created a sensation she couldn't immediately categorize. It was not entirely unpleasant. That bothered her more than the watching itself. In a building 40 minutes across the city, in a room with no windows and a table long enough to seat 14, Roman Valcourt sat at its head surrounded by 7 men who collectively managed more of the city's operational infrastructure than any combination of legitimate institutions could have claimed. The meeting had been running for 22 minutes and was running with exactly the efficiency that meetings ran when everyone present understood that the man at the head of the table did not tolerate any form of waste, not money, not time, not the particular variety of preening that men in rooms like this sometimes allowed themselves. He had not been thinking about the apartment on Crane Street. He was aware, in the background way of a man who tracked many things simultaneously, that the building was covered, that last night's situation had resolved without escalation. The man at the door had left quickly, with the characteristic speed of someone who had unexpectedly encountered a level of problem they hadn't accounted for. What Roman had not anticipated was the information that came back to him from his research team at 4:30 in the morning. Derek Sable, 29 years old. History of domestic incidents, none prosecuted, all archived, all following the specific pattern Roman had seen enough times to recognize without needing it described. A protective order obtained, and then, 3 months later, quietly dropped, not because the threat had abated, but because the order had created confrontations she couldn't control, and the official channels had demonstrated clearly that they weren't going to protect her. None of that was the part that required his attention. The part that required his attention was that Derek Sable had been running errands for the Dean organization for the better part of 2 years. Low-level, low-exposure work, the kind that gave someone just enough connection to claim protection without carrying enough weight to be worth actually protecting. It was a common arrangement in the city's lower operational tiers, and Roman was aware of it the way he was aware of most things that moved through the ecosystem around him, without particularly caring about any individual instance of it. What made this instance relevant was geography. The South Quarter was territory Roman had been in careful, patient negotiation over for the better part of a year. Not because he wanted it, he had enough, but because Dean's operation was sloppy in ways that created exposure for adjacent structures, and Roman had a policy against tolerating sloppiness in systems that shared walls with his own. He had been managing the situation with deliberate restraint. He did not want to disrupt it. A man connected to that organization appearing at the door of a woman who had accidentally connected to Roman's private line was not a coincidence he was prepared to accept at face value. His research team had spent the morning finding out whether it was deliberate. It wasn't. Derek Sable was not watching Mara Linden because Hector Dean had directed him to. He was watching her because he was obsessed with her in the specific, consuming way of certain men who could not tolerate the existence of something they had once controlled operating beyond their reach. His connection to the Dean organization was incidental, useful for resources and a limited kind of cover, but not the reason he was in this city. The reason he was in this city was that he had located her through a contact at a restaurant supply company that serviced the diner on Meridian Street, someone who remembered her face and had been paid enough to make the connection. Simpler, then. Not a surveillance operation. Not anything to do with Roman's territorial negotiations. Just a man who would not stop, who now had the resources and the connections to be persistent in ways he hadn't had before, and who was connected enough to the wrong organization that removing him through any obvious channel would be read as a territorial signal in a situation being managed through diplomacy. He was going to have to think carefully about the approach. That was the thought that had been running in the background while the meeting moved through its agenda, while he gave the responses that were required of him and made the decisions that were presented for his consideration. He was going to have to address this, and the clean solution, simply removing the problem, was complicated by Dean's connection, and the alternative of doing nothing was not available to him now that the situation had crossed into his awareness. He did not examine the other factor. The version of the factor that concerned the call itself, the quality of the voice on the other end of the line, the way it had sounded in the first seconds, barely a breath, stripped down to its most fundamental components by fear. He did not examine the small apartment's refrigerator with its fruit-shaped magnets and its archive of a child's attempts to draw the world. He did not examine the 4-year-old who had woken up in the middle of all of it and stared at him with the complete, undefended honesty of someone who had not yet learned to protect herself from her own reactions and had simply told him what she observed. He ended the meeting on schedule, returned to his office, stood at the window looking at the city below for several minutes, and then made a call. "I need a complete profile on Derek Sable," he said when the line connected. "Financial history, Dean organization connections, regular locations, patterns of movement." "Today?" After the profile, the voice asked. "I'll determine the approach." He paused, watching a cab move through the intersection below. "I want to know if he returns to Crane Street. If he does, I want to know before he gets within 3 blocks of the building." "Understood." He ended the call and remained at the window for a moment longer, looking at the city that had been his for so many years that he had stopped thinking about what it had cost him to make it so. The empire he had built was efficient, invisible to the systems that were supposed to prevent it, and entirely consuming. He had made his choices about what that required, and he had made them without regret. The window reflected his face back at him faintly in the glass, dark, sharp, closed. He turned away from it and went back to work. The sun had gone low and orange by the time Mara finished her shift and walked back toward the Holloway building, Lily's hand in hers, her bag over one shoulder, the October cold finding the gaps in her jacket collar. Lily was describing something that had happened at Mrs. Huang's involving a paint spill and a boy named Jackson and the resulting collaborative artwork that Mrs. Huang had called abstract. And Mara was listening and responding and watching the street the way she always did, checking coordinates, noting the absence of the things she had learned to fear, accounting for the presence of the dark sedan 2 blocks back, different car from the morning, same posture behind the wheel. She noticed, too, that the street had a different quality in the immediate vicinity of the Holloway building. She couldn't have described it precisely. Not less dangerous in any objective sense. The city was what it was, and her situation was what it was, but differently weighted, as if whatever Roman Valcourt had arranged had redistributed something in the ambient texture of the block, some variable she could sense but not name. He was standing near the entrance, not blocking it, not imposing himself into the space in any way that could be characterized as threatening. just standing at the edge of the small overhang that covered the front door, hands in the pockets of that same dark coat, watching the street in both directions with the easy, unhurried quality of someone who had arrived with time to spare and was not concerned about how it was spent. Mara stopped on the sidewalk 5 feet from him, Lily's hand still in hers. He looked at her, then at Lily, with that brief recalibration she had noticed the night before, the barely visible shift in his expression that she had no precise word for yet. Then back at her, and something in the set of his face not quite neutral now. Carrying the weight of information he had clearly spent the day acquiring told her that whatever conversation was about to happen, it was not going to be the last one. "We need to talk," he said. "About who he is." Mara looked at this man she had dialed by accident in the dark. This man who had come when she called without being asked, had posted someone on her building, had placed someone in her section at the diner, and was now standing outside her door at the end of the day with information she hadn't requested, but which she was already certain she needed. "Okay," she said. He held the door open for her, and Lily, without comment, not with the studied, performative courtesy that men sometimes produced as a demonstration of gentleness, just the simple functional act of making space for them to enter first. It was such a small thing, such a minimal gesture, but it told her something. In a year of calibrating threat, of reading what people communicated when they thought they weren't communicating anything, that small gesture told her something she wasn't yet ready to name. She walked through the door with her daughter's hand in hers, and the man who had answered her wrong number call followed behind, and the door closed on the cold October street. Whatever was coming next had already begun. The apartment felt different with him in it a second time. Mara couldn't have articulated exactly why. Everything was the same: the second-hand couch, the lamp, the fruit magnet refrigerator, the small table where she and Lily ate breakfast every morning with the radio on low because silence in the mornings had started to feel like something she needed to push back against. The apartment was identical to what it had been last night and every night before that. But Roman Valcourt standing in it again created the same effect as a change in barometric pressure, not visible, not something you could point to, but something the body registered anyway, some animal awareness of a shift in the density of the air. Lily had been settled back at Mrs. Huang's for the after-school program, which ran until 6 on weekdays, which meant Mara had 50 minutes before she needed to collect her. She put the kettle on because it gave her hands something to do, and because making tea was a thing that ordinary people did in ordinary circumstances, and she needed the reminder that ordinary circumstances still existed somewhere. "Sit down," she said, without looking at him. "If you're going to tell me something, tell me at the table. I don't like standing conversations." A pause. She turned to look. He was already pulling out one of the chairs, the wooden one, the one with the slightly uneven leg that rocked if you shifted your weight wrong, and he sat down in it with the same economy of motion as everything else he did. He did not look at the uneven leg. He simply adjusted, without comment, and became still. Mara brought 2 mugs to the table, set one in front of him, and sat across from him with both hands wrapped around hers. "Tell me," she said. He told her. He told her that Derek Sable had been running errands for a man named Hector Dean for 26 months, that the relationship was transactional and low-level, but that it meant Derek had access to resources and protection that he had not had when she left him, that this was almost certainly why he had been able to find her a second time. The kind of search that located someone who had been genuinely careful about disappearing required money and connections she had not anticipated him having. He told her that the connection to Dean made the situation more complicated than it would otherwise be, that removing Derek through the kind of direct intervention Roman would normally employ would be read, in certain quarters, as a territorial signal at a moment when territorial signals were unwelcome. He told her this not as an excuse or an apology, but as a briefing, the way you brief someone who needs information to understand their situation accurately. Mara listened without interrupting. She had learned a long time ago that the most useful thing she could do in conversations that contained critical information was to stay quiet until she had all of it, because interrupting generally resulted in getting partial answers instead of complete ones. "What does that mean for me?" she asked, when he stopped. "It means I can't handle this the way I normally would," he said. "Not immediately. Not without creating complications I'm not prepared to create yet." "Then what can you do?" He looked at her across the table. "What I'm already doing. Coverage on the building. A presence at your workplace. Eyes on his movements." "That's surveillance," Mara said. That's watching him move around the city while he watches me move around the city. That's not protection, Mr. Valcourt. That's just two sets of eyes on the same person. Something shifted in his expression, that near imperceptible recalibration she was starting to recognize, the acknowledgement that what she had said was accurate. It's the beginning of protection, he said. Surveillance precedes action. I need to know his patterns before I can disrupt them. How long does that take? A few days, possibly less. Mara set down her mug and looked at the table between them. A few days was manageable if nothing escalated. A few days was also an eternity if Derek decided that last night's failure had changed his timeline. She had no way of knowing which version was coming, and the uncertainty of it was its own kind of exhausting. Why are you doing this? She asked. The question landed in the space between them with a directness she hadn't entirely planned, but she didn't retract it. She had learned not to retract direct questions when she finally got up the courage to ask them, because the retraction always cost more than the answer did. Valcourt was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. You called, he said. I called the wrong number. Yes. She waited. Wrong number or not, he said. You called. And the situation you described is one I have a particular interest in not allowing to continue. A particular interest, she repeated. What does that mean? He looked at her with those winter gray eyes that gave away so precisely nothing. It means what it means, he said. It doesn't require further elaboration. Mara studied his face, running the calculation she was always running with people. What they were showing, what they were concealing, whether the gap between. Those two things was something to be concerned about. With most people, that gap was obvious once you knew what to look for. With Roman Valcourt, the gap was sealed closed by something more disciplined than she had encountered before. She couldn't see through it. She wasn't sure anyone could. But she noticed that when he said it doesn't require further elaboration, the slightest tension had moved through his jaw. A tell so small it was barely there. She filed it. All right, she said. A few days. But if Derek comes back before then, he won't. Flat. Absolute. The tone of someone who was not offering reassurance, but conveying a fact. The conversation my man had with him last night was sufficiently clear. What did they say? He looked at her steadily. Enough. She decided not to press that. She had enough to think about. He left 20 minutes later, the mug untouched, pausing at the door long enough to say that someone would be on the building overnight, and that if anything changed, if she saw Derek or anyone she didn't recognize who seemed to be watching the building, she should use the number on the card immediately. Not a wrong number this time, he said. It was the first thing he had said in the entire conversation that might have been something other than a briefing. The inflection was almost imperceptible, barely there and gone, like light catching the edge of something before it moves away. Mara stood at the closed door for a moment after he left. Then she went to collect her daughter. The next 3 days moved with a strange doubled quality. On the surface, everything was ordinary: the diner, the morning walks to Mrs. Huang's, the after-school pickup, the bedtime routine with its specific architecture of bath and story, and Lily's insistence on checking that George was comfortable before the lights went out. The rhythms of a small life, built from careful daily maintenance. On a second layer beneath that surface, everything had shifted. The man with the coffee in her section every morning, different faces but the same posture, the same quality of watching without seeming to watch. The dark sedan that changed its position every 12 hours or so but maintained its sight lines. The way her walk to work felt different, not safer exactly, but covered, the way you feel when someone has checked the perimeter ahead of you and left it clear. She did not see Derek. She also did not see Roman Valcourt, which was its own kind of awareness, the absence of something that had made itself felt strongly enough in 2 visits that its absence was now a presence of its own. She did not examine this observation in any depth. She was too busy being careful. On the evening of the 3rd day, Mara was sitting at the table after Lily's bedtime, working through the coupon organizer with the focused attention she gave it twice a week, when her phone buzzed with a message from the number on the card. There's something you need to know. Are you available to talk? She stared at the message for a moment, then typed back, yes. He called immediately. Derek Sable went to the Dean organization this morning, he said. He requested backup. Mara felt the blood leave her face. Backup for what? He didn't specify. He was asking for manpower, and he was asking for it in relation to an unresolved personal matter. A pause. That's how he described it. An unresolved personal matter. She was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. What does that mean for your situation? The diplomatic negotiations you mentioned. The pause that followed had a particular quality. You retain that. I retain most things, she said. It's a survival skill. What does it mean? It means Dean has a choice to make, he said. He can provide what Sable is asking for, which creates an exposure he currently doesn't want. Or he can decline, which leaves Sable without the resources he's trying to acquire. The outcome of that choice will determine what I need to do next. And in the meantime? In the meantime, nothing changes on your end. My people are on the building. You maintain your routines. You don't tell anyone about this conversation. I don't have anyone to tell. Another pause. Smaller this time. Less calculated. No one. Gloria at the diner knows I'm in a difficult situation. She doesn't know the specifics. Mara traced the edge of the coupon organizer with one finger. I don't bring people inside the problem if I can help it. It puts them at risk, and it creates obligation I can't always pay back. That's a lonely way to live. She hadn't expected that. From him, specifically the plain directness of it, the absence of the softening that people usually applied when they said something that was essentially an observation about someone's pain. Yes, she said. It is. The line was quiet for a few seconds. Then, I'll call you when I know how Dean responds. He ended the call. Mara sat at the table in the quiet apartment for a long time after, the coupon organizer open in front of her, the phone face down on the table beside it. She was thinking about the question he'd asked. No one. The two syllables of it, and the quality of the pause that followed her answer. It had not sounded like sympathy. It had sounded like someone filing information that surprised them. She had no idea what to do with that. So she set it aside, filed it in the section of her mind that she maintained for things she didn't have the bandwidth to process yet, and went back to the coupons. The diner was slower than usual on the fourth morning, a Thursday with low, heavy clouds and the smell of rain coming in from the north, the kind of weather that kept people inside if they had the option. Gloria was in a philosophical mood. She got like that when business was slow, prone to dispensing observations about life that were simultaneously obvious and somehow useful. She was refilling the salt shakers and talking about her first marriage. The thing about being with the wrong person, Gloria said, setting down the salt and picking up the pepper, is that after long enough, you forget that being with the right one is even a category that exists. You start thinking what you have is just what people have. Mara was wiping down the counter. Is this a conversation about something specific? It's a conversation about the man who has been sitting in your section every morning for 4 days. Mara kept wiping the counter. He's just a regular. He hasn't ordered anything except coffee. He tips 40%. Gloria's voice was neutral and completely unconvinced. He watches the door and the street and you, in that order, on rotation, every 45 seconds. Gloria, I'm not asking questions, Gloria said, putting the pepper down. I'm making an observation. Whoever arranged that man in that booth did it for your benefit. And whoever arranged it has enough resources to maintain it for 4 consecutive days without being inconvenienced. She picked up the next shaker. I don't know what that means and I'm not asking. I'm just saying it's different from what you've had before, baby. Different is worth noticing. Mara looked at her. Gloria was looking at the shaker. Different isn't always better, Mara said. No, Gloria agreed. But sometimes it is. The rain came in the afternoon, arriving with the particular insistence of autumn rain that intended to stay a while. Mara's shift ended at 4. She collected Lily from Mrs. Huang's at 4:30 and walked home with her daughter's hood pulled up and her own hair getting wet because she had forgotten her umbrella for the 3rd time in a week, which was the kind of small failure that accumulated into a texture of daily life. Lily wanted to jump in every puddle. Mara let her jump in 2 of them and negotiated around the rest. By the time they reached the Holloway building, Lily's boots were damp and she was deeply satisfied with herself, and Mara had forgotten, for the length of a city block, to monitor the street. She realized it as they reached the building entrance, and the realization came with the complicated feeling it always did, half relief that nothing had happened in the moment she was unguarded, half grief for the person she used to be, the one who walked down streets without running threat assessments. She had been that person. She wanted to remember it. The lobby was empty except for the building super's jacket hanging on the hook inside the door, which meant Luis had been doing his rounds. Mara let them in, Lily already working on her bootlaces in the elevator, George tucked under her arm with the rabbit's ears flopping. "Mama," Lily said, as the elevator rose. "Is the tall man coming back?" Mara looked at her daughter, crouched over her boot. "I don't know, sweetheart. I think he will." Lily got one boot off and started on the other with the focused determination she brought to most physical tasks. He looked like he was thinking about something. People who are thinking about something always come back. For years old, Mara sometimes forgot, in the daily negotiations of parenting, that her daughter was observing everything. "Maybe," she said. Lily held up the boot triumphantly. "Got it." The call from Valcourt's number came at 9 that evening, after Lily was asleep and the apartment had settled into its nighttime quiet. Mara answered on the second ring. Dean declined. His voice was even. He told Sable the situation was personal and outside the scope of what the organization involved itself in. Something in Mara's chest unclenched fractionally. "That's good. It's useful. It means Sable is operating without organizational support. It also means he's likely to escalate." A pause. Men in his situation without the resources they were counting on, facing the kind of failure he experienced outside your building 4 nights ago, they tend to move faster than they would otherwise. They stop calculating and start reacting. "How soon?" "Soon. Possibly tonight. Possibly tomorrow." He paused again. "I'd like to move you." "Move me where?" "Somewhere more defensible than the 4th floor of a building with an accessible fire escape." Mara sat with that for a moment. The practical part of her, the part that had gotten very good at rapid threat assessment, acknowledged immediately that he was right. The apartment's vulnerabilities had been visible to her from the day she moved, and she had accepted them as the best available compromise between security and affordability. But the other part of her, the part that had spent 7 months rebuilding a life from scratch and understood precisely what it had cost to create even this thin version of stability, pushed back against the idea with a force that surprised her. "This is our home," she said. The words came out quieter than she intended. "I know it's not much. I know it's a 4th-floor walk-up with a leaky radiator and a fire escape anyone can climb. But Lily knows it. She has her room here, her drawings on the refrigerator, her understanding of where things are when she wakes up scared in the night." She stopped. "I've already moved her once. I won't do it again unless I have no choice." The silence on the line had a different quality from his usual silences. She couldn't identify it precisely. "All right," he said. "Then I need more coverage on the building. 2 men on the fire escape, 2 in the lobby, 1 on the street. 5 people." "Yes." "Is that—" She stopped. She had been about to ask if that was necessary. The question died because she already knew the answer, and asking it would have been asking for reassurance rather than information, and she had made herself a rule against that years ago. "Okay," she said instead. "I'll also need you to keep your phone on and with you at all times. Not in another room. On your person." "I already do that." "I know. I'm telling you anyway." Another silence. She listened to the ambient sound of wherever he was, some distant background hum of a city at night. Traffic, the barely there suggestion of wind. If you're as deep into this story as I am right now, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. I upload new stories every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming. Your support is the reason I keep going. Now, back to them. "Mr. Valcourt," she said. "Roman." She paused at that. The correction had been brief, automatic, the kind of thing that comes out before someone has decided whether to say it. "Roman," she said. "Why does this feel like something bigger than a wrong number?" The line was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer, might retreat behind the flat, informational professionalism he had maintained in every exchange so far. Then, "Because it is." She waited. "I had a sister," he said. "Younger. 8 years younger than me." His voice had not changed, still the same even, controlled instrument. But something in it was different in a way she felt rather than heard, like the difference between a room that looks empty and a room that has been deliberately emptied. She was in a situation that had the same shape as yours. A man who wouldn't stop. A system that couldn't help. A pattern she couldn't get outside of. A pause. "I was too involved in building something that I had decided mattered to see how serious it was until it was too late to do anything but arrive at a hospital and be told information that came too late to be useful." Mara was very still on her end of the line. "I'm sorry," she said. The words were inadequate. They were always inadequate for that particular category of loss, but she meant them in the full, uncomplicated way of someone who understood grief. It was 11 years ago, he said. The way he said it suggested that the time elapsed was not the same as the weight being different. I don't talk about it. Then why? Because you asked why this is bigger than a wrong number. A pause. That's the answer. She absorbed it. Outside the apartment window, the rain was still coming down, the streetlights making the wet pavement glow orange and white. The city was doing its nighttime. Things, moving, breathing, generating its ordinary noise. Inside the apartment, the radiator made its small, irregular sounds. Everything was where it had been 5 minutes ago. Something had changed anyway. She would have been 27, he said. Then, go to sleep. There are people on the building. If anything changes, you'll know. He ended the call. Mara sat with the phone in her hands for a long time, looking at nothing, thinking about a 27-year-old woman she would never meet. About the specific shape of grief that lived in the voice of a man who had decided that what happened to his sister would never happen again if he could prevent it, who had built an empire partly, she understood now, as a monument to that decision, who had answered a wrong number call at midnight not because it was convenient, but because some part of him had recognized the shape of the situation before he had fully processed it consciously. She turned off the lamp and went to bed, and for the first time in 4 nights, she slept through until morning. The trouble arrived on the 6th day, not from Derek directly, but from a direction Mara hadn't anticipated. She was coming out of the pharmacy 2 blocks from the diner, a paper bag with Lily's allergy prescription in one hand and her phone in the other, when she saw the woman. She was standing on the sidewalk across the street, not looking at Mara, looking at her phone, dressed in the anonymous urban camouflage of jeans and a dark jacket. Mara would not have noticed her at all except that she had seen her that morning, outside the daycare, standing in the same quality of inattentiveness. And the morning before, outside the diner. She was not one of Roman's people. She was too unpracticed in the stillness, too slightly self-conscious about looking like she was trying to disappear into the street. Roman's people were genuinely invisible. This woman was someone who was trying to be invisible and had not had enough experience with it yet. Mara kept walking, kept her pace even, did not look back. She called the number on the card. He answered before the second ring. Yes, there's a woman. I've seen her 3 times in 2 days. Outside the daycare, outside the diner, and now outside the pharmacy. She's not one of yours. A beat. Describe her. Mara described her. Where are you now? Walking back toward the diner. She's behind me, about half a block, keeping distance. Keep walking. Don't change your pace. Don't turn around. I'll call you back in 4 minutes. He was back in 3. Her name is Cassandra Riels, he said. She does freelance research work. She's been hired to track your movements and your daughter's schedule. Mara's free hand clenched around the prescription bag. Derek hired her. Yes. She has no criminal record and no particular skills beyond basic observation work. She's not a threat physically. She's a data collector. A pause. But the data she's collecting is being sent to Sable in real time. He knows your pharmacy, your routes, your exact schedule. He's building a map, she said. The word came out flat. She had lived inside one of his maps before. She knew what came after the cartography phase. He's figuring out the gaps in coverage. Yes. She stopped walking, moved to the side of the sidewalk next to the building wall, and stood with her back to the brick because she needed, for a moment, the physical reality of something solid. What do I do? Nothing. I'll handle Ms. Riels. What does that mean? It means she'll stop collecting data. His voice was even. Not threatening. He never performed menace, she had realized, because he didn't need to. The absence of performance was itself the statement. And it means Sable loses his map before he can use it. And then, a pause. The longest pause he had allowed himself in a conversation yet. And then, he said, we deal with Sable directly. She heard the shift in it. Not the surveillance and patience approach of the first few days. Something that had moved into a different category. Your diplomatic situation with Dean, she said, has changed, he said. Sable's escalation has changed it. A man who hires surveillance on a woman and a child, in a city where I have indicated a protective interest, is making a statement whether he intends to or not. Allowing it to continue would also be a statement. A protective interest, she said. Yes. Is that what this is? A silence. Then, go back to the diner. Don't vary your route. Riels will stop following you within the hour. I'll come by the apartment tonight. She stood against the brick wall for another moment after he ended the call, watching the street, watching the ordinary afternoon city move around her. Half a block away, the woman who had been cataloging her daughter's daycare schedule was still standing outside a dry-cleaning shop, pretending to read something on her phone. I have indicated a protective interest. She turned that phrase over, examining it from different angles the way she examined things she needed to understand precisely before she decided what to do with them. It was careful language, deliberate language, the language of a man who chose every word before he deployed it and who had, in that sentence, chosen to say something that went further than briefings and surveillance logistics, while retaining enough formal distance to be walked back if necessary. She had been listening to the gap between what people said and what they meant for years. She knew the sound of the gap getting smaller. She went back to the diner. She did not look back. And within 40 minutes, when she next looked out the window toward the street, the woman in the dark jacket was gone. He came to the apartment at 8 that evening, after Lily was asleep and the supper dishes were done and Mara had spent an hour sitting at the table trying to read and not reading. He knocked 3 even beats, the same as the first night, and she opened the door without asking who it was, which told her something about herself that she wasn't entirely ready to acknowledge. He came in. He sat at the table. For the first time since the night she had called him, he did not move toward the door after 10 minutes. She made tea again, set it in front of him. He wrapped his hands around the mug this time, which she noticed because he hadn't before, and she had an intimate enough understanding of small behavioral shifts to register what it might mean. "Tell me about Sable's plan," she said. "The real one, not the diplomatic version." He looked at her across the table. There was something different in his face tonight. Softer. She wouldn't have used that word for a man whose default setting appeared to be constructed from something denser than ordinary human material, but less sealed. The conversation last night had opened something, not much, but enough to be visible to someone paying the kind of attention she paid. "He's been watching the building since Tuesday," he said, "looking for a window. My coverage has prevented any viable one from appearing, which is why he hired Riels to find the gaps he couldn't locate himself. And what will he do with those gaps? He'll try to get to you when you're outside the covered zone. Or to Lily." He held her gaze. "Probably Lily. She represents leverage in a way you don't, to a man like him. She's smaller. She's accessible through a different set of points than you are. She's the thing that would stop you running." Mara listened to this with the flat, focused attention she had developed for information she needed to hold without allowing it to break her, which was its own learned skill. She had gotten very good at it. She was less good at it tonight, she noticed, with the specific subject being Lily. Something about the phrase "probably Lily" moved through her with a ferocity that bypassed all her trained controls and went straight to the part of her that had, since February of a year 4 years ago, reorganized entirely around one imperative. "He won't get near her," Roman said. The words came out quieter than his usual register. Not soft, he didn't do soft, but different. Lower. More direct, somehow, as if he had stripped away the briefing format and was just saying a thing he meant. "I want you to understand that. Whatever else is uncertain about this situation, that specific thing is not." She looked at him. She looked at the quality of his stillness, at the particular set of his jaw, at the thing in his eyes that she had been watching develop over 6 days of conversation, something that had started as impersonal assessment and had become something else without either of them acknowledging the transition. She thought about what he had told her last night. The sister. The hospital. 11 years ago. A grief so contained it had become architecture. "You made a decision," she said. He met her gaze. "Yes." "When?" He was quiet for a moment. "The night you called." She absorbed that. "The night you called," not the next morning when the research came back, not the second conversation when the scope of the problem became clear. "The night you called." "The wrong number." The 3 words whispered in the dark. "Why didn't you just hang up?" she asked. "Because you said please." The words came out with a simplicity that made her chest ache. "And then you said your daughter's name." Mara looked down at the table, at her own hands, wrapped around the mug, the faint scar along her left thumb from a kitchen accident 3 years ago that she never thought about anymore except in moments like this when she was cataloging herself from the outside. She had been trying, for so many years, to be enough. Strong enough, careful enough, invisible enough, sustainable enough. To carry the weight of her situation without it showing on her face, without it affecting her work, without it giving Derek the satisfaction of visible damage. She was tired. She had been tired for so long that the tiredness had become indistinguishable from her baseline state, so fully integrated into her ordinary experience that she had stopped noticing it as a distinct condition. "I don't know how to let someone help me," she said. She hadn't planned to say it, but she was finding, with this particular man, that planned and unplanned had different weights than they usually did, that the unplanned things had a tendency to come out when the distance between them was this small and the quality of his attention was this specific. "I've been doing this alone for so long that I'm not sure I remember how the alternative works." He was quiet. He did not rush to fill the space with reassurance or comfort, did not produce the kind of response that would have made her feel heard in the performed way of someone who had learned the vocabulary of emotional support. He just listened, held the space, let her words exist in it without immediately trying to do something about them. After a moment, he said, "You don't have to remember. You just have to allow it." She looked up. He was watching her with that expression. She had no precise word for the one that wasn't warmth, but was something adjacent to it, something that existed in the space between impersonal and personal, something that suggested the gap was narrowing from his side, without him having fully decided yet to close it. "Is that what you're offering?" she said. "Someone to allow?" He held her gaze. "I'm offering what I've already been providing. I'm simply doing it." He paused, with less pretense about the reason. Mara sat with that. Outside the window, the rain that had been threatening all week had finally arrived in earnest, hitting the glass with steady, insistent sound, filling the apartment with the close, warm feeling of being inside while weather happened outside. The radiator made its irregular sounds. Somewhere in the bedroom, Lily shifted in her sleep and said something unintelligible, and then was quiet again. "The less pretense reason," she said. "Your sister." Partly, she echoed. She looked at his hands still wrapped around the mug, at the specific quality of tension in them, controlled, as everything about him was controlled, but present. She had learned to read the presence of tension in controlled people as a more reliable indicator than the tension itself. "What's the other part?" His eyes held hers for a long moment. "You know what the other part is." She did. She had known what it was building toward since the first night, had been tracking its development the way she tracked everything that mattered, carefully, with full attention, without letting herself look at it directly for too long in case looking directly at it changed it into something else. But he had said it. With those 5 words delivered in that flat, certain voice, "You know what the other part is." He had stepped out of the careful professional distance they had both been maintaining and made it visible. She looked away first. At the window. At the rain. "This is a complicated situation," she said. "Yes. You're..." She stopped. Started again. "Whatever you are in this city. The kind of man you are. The things your people do when you give them instructions. That's not something I can bring my daughter into without knowing what it actually means." "I know. I'm not." She pressed her lips together. "I'm not saying no to something you haven't asked. I'm saying that whatever this is, if it's going anywhere, it needs to go slowly. I need to be able to see what I'm moving toward." "I understand that," he said. And then, with a simplicity that she had started to recognize as the form his honesty took, "I'm not asking you for anything tonight. I haven't asked you for anything at all." "I know," she said. "That's part of what's making this complicated." Something moved in his expression, that fractional shift, barely visible, that she was beginning to understand was his version of what other people expressed with their whole face. It might have been recognition. It might have been something that lived adjacent to amusement. It was gone before she could read it fully. He stood, set the mug down, moved toward the door with that familiar economy of motion, coat settling back into place. "The coverage stays on the building," he said. "Tomorrow I'll deal with Sable directly." "How?" He looked at her from the doorway. "I'll tell him what he's standing next to. That's usually sufficient." "And if it's not?" He held her gaze for one moment, steady, clear, without any ambiguity about what the answer was. "Then it will be sufficient by other means." He left. The door closed. Mara stood in the kitchen with both mugs, listening to the rain, listening to the building settle, listening to the specific quiet of the apartment that was now a different quality of quiet than it had ever been before. Not the hell-breath quiet of threat, not even the relieved quiet of threat temporarily removed. Something fuller, something that had space in it. She washed the mugs and went to bed. She did not go to sleep easily. She lay in the dark listening to Lily's breathing through the thin wall between the bedrooms, running through the conversation with the thoroughness she applied to everything that mattered. The sister, the hospital, 11 years. You know what the other part is. I haven't asked you for anything at all. She turned each piece over, examined it, set it down, picked up the next. The thing she kept returning to was the moment he had said, "Because you said please." The straightforward confession of it, not a strategy, not an attempt to establish himself as a certain kind of person, just a fact about what had happened and why. She had said please. He had stayed on the line. He had come. She had spent years among people who constructed elaborate systems to justify the things they wanted and the things they did, had lived inside one man's system of self-justification for long enough to recognize the architecture of it from the inside. This was not that. This was she searched for the word direct. Even the things he withheld were withheld directly, without pretense about the fact of withholding. The gap between what he said and what he meant was smaller with him than it had been with anyone in recent memory. She was not going to let herself be foolish about this. She had been foolish before, and she knew precisely what it had cost her. And she had a daughter whose safety and stability and understanding of what the world could be asked to be were worth more than anything she wanted for herself. She was going to be careful. She was going to be slow. She was going to insist on seeing what she was moving toward before she moved toward it. But she was also going to be honest with herself, in the dark, with no one watching, honest about the quality of the feeling that had been building over 6 days in the margins of fear and threat and survival logistics. About the way the apartment felt different with him in it. About the way the city felt different with his people in it. About the way she had slept last night for the first time in weeks without waking to check whether the lock was still engaged. Not safe. She still wasn't using that word, but closer to it than she had been in a long time. She was almost asleep when the sound came. Not from outside the window, this time from her phone, a buzz on the nightstand. She picked it up, squinting at the screen. A text from an unknown number. One line. No name. I'm still here. Waiting changes nothing. Mara's blood went cold. She sat up and called Roman's number. He answered in one ring. She could tell from the ambient sound that he had not been asleep. He has a different phone, she said. He just texted me. I'm still here. Waiting changes nothing. A pause, not the processing pause, the other one, the one that was something closer to controlled anger. Forward me the number. She did. Go check that Lily is in her room, he said. Turn on the light when you get there. Mara was already moving down the hall, phone to her ear. She pushed open Lily's door. Her daughter was there, the familiar shape under the dinosaur blanket. George tucked in beside her, her dark hair fanned across the pillow, her chest rising and falling with the deep, even rhythm of someone completely undisturbed. She's here, Mara said. She's fine. Good. His voice was level, but there was something underneath the level now, something that she had not heard in it before, something that had the same quality as the moment before a weather system changes. Lock your bedroom door and stay on the phone. I'm 20 minutes out. Roman. She stood in Lily's doorway, looking at her sleeping daughter. What are you going to do when you get here? A pause. Make a very clear statement, he said. To Derek. To anyone who needs to hear it. She looked at Lily. At George the rabbit. At the scribbled sun drawing taped to the wall above the bed. The one Lily had made at Mrs. Huang's 2 weeks ago and declared was specifically for their apartment. Okay, she said. She went to her room. She locked the door. She sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in her hand and listened to the rain and to Roman Valcourt's breathing on the open line, steady, controlled, already in motion, and waited. Whatever was coming fast now. She could feel it in the specific quality of the silence between them, not absence, but accumulation. The way everything that had been building since a wrong number rang in the dark 6 nights ago was gathering itself toward a point. The text blinked on her other screen. I'm still here. Waiting changes nothing. Mara looked at it without flinching. Then she looked at the time. 8 minutes since she called. 12 to go. She straightened her back against the headboard, both hands wrapped around the phone, and thought about a man driving through rain toward her building with the particular focused determination of someone who had decided that the space between what was happening and what he would allow to happen had just closed to zero. She thought about what it felt like to have someone arrive. Not because she had asked correctly or applied enough pressure or made herself small enough to be considered worth the effort. Just because she had called. Because she had said please. She hadn't known, until it happened, how much of her life she had spent not knowing what that felt like. 12 minutes. 11. She held the phone and she waited. And for the first time and longer than she could accurately calculate, waiting did not feel like the worst thing in the world. It felt, instead, like the moment before something changed. He arrived in 11 minutes. She knew because she had been counting not obsessively, not in the rigid, anxiety-driven way she had counted seconds during other waits in other dark rooms, but with the particular focused patience of someone who had made an agreement with time, who had said to herself, he said 12 minutes, and she was going to believe that, and she was going to stay exactly where she was until it was true. The knock came at 11 minutes and 40 seconds. 3 beats. Even. Measured. The same as every time. She unlocked the bedroom door and walked down the hallway to the front door and looked through the peephole. Roman stood in the corridor, coat damp from the rain. 2 of his men behind him, not the politely invisible surveillance detail she had grown accustomed to over the past 6 days, but something that carried a different quality. More present. Prepared in a way that the word present didn't entirely cover. She opened the door. He came in without the usual pause at the threshold, moving directly to the center of the room with an efficiency that told her the social geometry of the space was not currently his concern. He turned and looked at her with a sharpness in his expression that was not quite what she would call emotion. She was not sure she had the vocabulary for what lived in his face right now, but something that had moved several degrees away from the controlled impersonality that was his baseline. "Are you all right?" he said. Not a question. A calibration. Yes. She crossed her arms, not from defensiveness, but from the old compression habit, the need to hold herself together at the seams when everything was moving quickly. Lily's asleep. She doesn't know anything happened. Good. He looked at the phone in her hand. Let me see the message. She handed it over. He read it once, the way he read everything completely, in a single pass, without the rereading that suggested uncertainty. He handed the phone back. His jaw was set in a way she had not seen before. Something in the stillness of him was different tonight, carrying an energy beneath it that was not agitation. He was too fundamentally controlled for that, but something that had been compressed very tightly and was being held in place by a decision rather than by its natural absence. "Where is he?" she asked. 3 blocks south. He looked at her. "He's been there for 2 hours. Stationary. He was waiting for your coverage to thin out." "Yes." "And has it?" "No." The word came out with a flatness that contained everything. "It has not thinned out. It will not thin out. That's the piece of information he hasn't fully absorbed yet." He paused. "I'm going to go explain it to him." Mara looked at this man standing in her living room with the rain-damp coat and the contained intensity that was currently the most palpable thing in the apartment, and she thought about what explain it to him meant, coming from him, in this context, at this hour. She had spent the past week understanding, incrementally, what Roman Valcourt was in the architecture of this city. She was not naive about what that meant. She had never been naive about it. She had opened the door 6 nights ago knowing what she was looking at, had made the calculation with full information and decided she could live with it, because the alternative was to keep doing what she had been doing alone, and alone was demonstrably not working. But understanding something intellectually and watching it leave your living room to act were different experiences. "Roman." He turned at the door. Both his men were already in the hallway. She stood in the middle of the room, arms still crossed, looking at him across the space between them. She thought about what she wanted to say. There were several options, and none of them were the right thing. She settled for the true thing. "Come back," she said. Something moved in his face. That fractional shift there and gone, smaller than anything most people would have registered, but she had gotten very good at reading him in the past week, and she caught it fully. It was not surprise, exactly. It was the look of a man who had not expected to hear something that he recognized the weight of when it arrived. "Yes," he said. The door closed. She stood in the living room for a long moment, listening to the rain and the absence of footsteps in the hallway and the particular quality of silence that existed when a man like that had just left your apartment with a specific purpose. Then she went and sat in the chair nearest Lily's room, the old one with the slightly worn armrest she had been meaning to recover for months, and she waited. She did not pretend, in the waiting, that she was at peace with this. She was not. The part of her that had spent years learning to distrust decisive men who moved through the world with this kind of absolute certainty about their right to act, was running its objections at full volume. She heard them. She held them. She did not dismiss them, because dismissing legitimate internal warnings was something she had also spent years learning not to do. But underneath the objections was the other thing. The 7 months of building and rebuilding and being careful and being vigilant and being, above everything else, responsible for a 4-year-old's entire understanding of what it meant to exist in the world. The months before that, the years before that. The accumulation of it. The weight of being the only person standing between Lily and everything that wanted to hurt them. She was so tired of standing there alone. She sat in the chair by Lily's door and listened to the rain and the radiator and the city doing its nighttime things, and she waited. 40 minutes later, her phone buzzed. A text from Roman's number. 4 words. It's handled. I'm coming back. She exhaled something that had been sitting in her chest since the text from Derek's new number, something that had been there longer than that. If she was being honest, something she had been holding since a night 14 months ago, when she had strapped her daughter into a car seat and driven until the city she was fleeing disappeared behind her. She put the phone face down on the armrest and closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she was looking at the drawing taped beside Lily's door, one Lily had made last week, a picture of the two of them, identifiable mostly by the fact that one figure was taller than the other and both of them were smiling, the sun enormous and orange overhead. She had drawn it in 15 minutes and presented it to Mara with the unself-conscious pride of someone who had created something they believed in, and Mara had put it up immediately without being asked because it was the most accurate portrait of her life that currently existed anywhere. The knock came 22 minutes later. She opened the door before the third beat. He was wet from the rain. More than before, the coat darker across the shoulders, his hair catching the hallway light. His face was composed. She would not have described it as unaffected, not tonight, not with what she had just learned he had gone out and done on her behalf, but it was composed in the way that suggested the significant thing had occurred and been processed and filed away, and what remained now was the aftermath, which was its own separate thing to navigate. He came in. She closed the door. They stood in the middle of the living room looking at each other for a moment, and neither of them said anything. Because there are situations in which the first person to speak concedes something, and neither of them was constitutionally built for unnecessary concession. Then she said, "Are you hurt?" He looked faintly surprised. Not much. He was too controlled for much, but a fraction. No. Good. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on, because it was the thing she did, and because it gave the moment somewhere to go. Sit down. He sat down. At the table. At his chair. She had started thinking of it as his chair, which was a development she noted without dwelling on. He set both hands flat on the table, palms down, and looked at them briefly with an expression she couldn't entirely decode, and then looked at her. "Tell me what level of detail you actually want," he said. "About tonight." She turned from the counter. She appreciated the directness of the question, the refusal to assume either that she needed to be protected from the information or that she wanted all of it. The acknowledgement that it was her choice. "He's not coming back," she said. "I need to know that with certainty." "He's not coming back. Is he alive?" A pause. "Yes." She absorbed that. "Where is he?" "On his way out of the city, under certain clearly communicated expectations about what happens if he returns." He met her eyes. "The communication was conducted in terms that were sufficiently unambiguous that I don't anticipate requiring a second conversation. His connection to Dean has been addressed. Dean was made aware that his associate had been conducting activity in my vicinity without my knowledge, and that I found the oversight concerning. He was also made aware that the matter has been resolved and that no further expansion of the situation is required on his end, provided certain boundaries are maintained going forward." He held her gaze. "We reached a clear understanding." Mara turned back to the counter and poured the water, brought both mugs to the table, sat across from him, wrapped her hands around the warmth of it. She was thinking about what she had just been told. The precision of it, not cleaned up, not softened, just reported in the specific, unembellished way that she had come to understand was how he communicated with people he respected enough to give accurate information. "The research woman," she said, Cassandra Riels, received an explanation of the potential professional consequences of continuing to take this particular category of client. The faintest possible shift at the corner of his mouth. "I understand." She found it persuasive. Mara looked at him across the table. The lamp was on behind her, the rain still moving against the window, the apartment doing its small, ordinary sounds around them. Lily was asleep. The lock was engaged. The building was covered. And across the table from her sat a man who had, in the space of 6 days, rearranged the landscape of her danger so completely that the particular shape of threat she had been navigating for over a year was simply no longer present. She didn't know what to do with gratitude at this scale. She had not had a lot of practice with it. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to. I know I don't have to." She kept her eyes on his face. "I want to. I want to say it directly and have you hear it, without it being diminished or redirected or wrapped in all the complications that probably surround it. You helped me. I'm grateful." She paused. "That's it. That's the whole sentence." Something settled in his expression, the specific settling of a man who has received something he hadn't known he was waiting for and is deciding, with the careful economy he applies to all decisions, what to do with it. "You're welcome," he said. They drank their tea. The rain moved against the glass. Lily made the small sound she sometimes made in deep sleep, a syllable without meaning, something the body produced as proof of its own continuity. Both of them turned toward the hallway when they heard it, and then both of them looked back at the table, and neither of them commented on the shared instinct, because commenting on it would have required acknowledging something they were both, for the moment, circling without approaching. "What happens now?" Mara asked. "Practically. Not," she paused, "not the other thing. Practically." He understood the distinction. "The coverage on the building stays for another 2 weeks. Standard protocol after a resolution, enough time to verify that the resolution held, that there are no residual elements, no associates of his with their own grievances." He considered. "After that, you'll have a direct line that's monitored 24 hours. If anything changes, if anyone approaches you or Lily, you use it, and someone responds within 10 minutes regardless of the hour. You'd maintain that indefinitely?" "Yes." She looked at him. "That's significant resources. For a wrong number." He met her gaze without hesitation. "For you," he said. "Not for the wrong number." The words went into the air between them and stayed there. She didn't look away from them. She also didn't move toward them, not yet, because she had said slow and she had meant it, and she was going to honor that even when everything in her was noting the particular quality of how this man said things, the absence of performance in it, the refusal to dress the thing up in more or less than it was. "I meant what I said before," she said, "about needing to see where I'm moving before I move. I know. I have a daughter whose entire world is the size of this apartment and Mrs. Huang's daycare and a diner 2 blocks away. Whatever I bring into that world has to be something she's safe inside. I know that too." She stopped. Started again. "What you are in this city. I'm not going to pretend I haven't thought about what that means. What it would mean for her." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What I am in this city is not what I am in this apartment." He looked at the table, and then at her, and there was something in the directness of it that required a particular kind of courage, she understood, for a man whose whole architecture was built around controlled disclosure. "What I am capable of is not the same as what I intend. I don't bring this city into the spaces where it isn't required." A pause that I haven't, in a very long time, had spaces where it wasn't required. She heard what he had not said. The shape of the absence in those last words. A man who had not, in a long time, had anything worth keeping outside the empire. Who had made his choices and built his walls and maintained them with the same efficiency he brought to everything. And who had not, until a wrong number rang in the dark, had occasion to question whether the walls were a solution or a prison. She was not going to let herself be reckless about this. She was going to be careful. She was going to be slow. But she also looked at him across the table, at this man who had come when she called without being asked, and who had told her about his sister, and who had said, "Because you said please," in a voice stripped clean of everything it didn't need to contain. And she thought, "I see you." Not all of you. She knew there were rooms in him she had not been anywhere near yet. Rooms she might not ever reach. Rooms that might require more time and more trust than either of them could promise right now. But enough. Enough to see the shape of what was there. "Tell me something," she said, "that has nothing to do with Derek, or Dean, or coverage on the building." He looked at her for a moment. The request had caught him slightly off balance, not much, barely visible, but she caught it. "Such as anything. What did you do today before I called you?" A longer pause. She watched him locate the question inside the framework of his daily existence and find that it required him to think rather than reach, because the answer was not something he usually produced on request. I reviewed contracts for a logistics restructuring we've been planning for 8 months, he said. I had a conversation with a city councilman that I found approximately as productive as I expected, which is to say not very. I had lunch alone. He paused. I thought about the conversation we had last night. She kept her expression level, but she felt the words land. Which part of it? Most of it. He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. The part about allowing someone to help. And the part after that. You know what the other part is. She remembered the kitchen light and the rain and the way the distance between them had felt, in that moment, like something with a specific and measurable quantity. Me too, she said. The rain moved against the glass. The radiator made its sound. In the bedroom, Lily slept. They sat at the table for another hour, talking about things that had nothing to do with danger. It was, she would think later, one of the stranger and more unexpectedly precious hours of the past year, the discovery that when you removed the threat context from their conversations, what remained was not awkwardness, but something that had its own momentum, its own capacity to generate warmth. He was not easy in the ordinary sense. He did not make small talk. He either meant something or he didn't say it. But he listened with a completeness she had rarely encountered, and when he spoke it was always worth listening to. And the space between his sentences had a quality she was starting to think of as restful, the quality of a silence that was occupied by something rather than by absence. She told him about graphic design, the sketchbook she had kept, the instructor who had written promising in red ink. The path she had been on before the years with Derek made the idea of a future career feel like a luxury she wasn't entitled to. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Do you still sketch?" She thought about the last time. More than a year ago, she said. He nodded once. The way he nodded when he was registering something as a fact, not agreeing with it. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. But she had the impression he had filed it. He told her briefly, without elaboration, about an interest in maps. Historical cartography. The kind of thing that had no application to his professional life whatsoever, which was apparently part of its value. He had a collection of antique maps of cities as they had existed in other centuries, and he had spent years tracing the places where the streets had changed and the places where they hadn't, finding the preserved bones of old cities inside the modern ones. She looked at him while he said this and thought about a man who spent his evenings studying the persistence of structure through change, and thought that it was probably not entirely coincidental. At 11:45, she said she needed to sleep. He stood immediately, no lingering. No extending the moment past where she had set the boundary. That was another thing she had noticed about him. He did not push against the edges she established. He accepted them as the dimensions of the space available to him and worked inside them without resentment, without the subtle testing she had learned to expect from men who respected stated limits only until they thought you weren't watching. At the door, he paused in the way he sometimes did. She had learned to read those pauses as the moments when something was occurring to him that he was deciding whether to say. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll be on the street when you take Lily to Mrs. Huang's." He held her eyes. Not as coverage. As he paused, a parallel route. She understood the distinction. Coverage was professional, operational. A parallel route was something else. A parallel route was a man who wanted to walk in the same direction as the people he had decided mattered, without making demands about it. "Okay," she said. He left. She stood at the closed door for a moment, hands still on the frame, and allowed herself, very briefly, and without the usual accompanying anxiety, to feel what she was feeling. Then she went to bed, and she slept. The morning was cold and clear after the rain, the sky a pale October blue, the streets washed clean and still damp underfoot. Lily wore the red coat, her favorite, the one with the hood that she claimed made her look like a dragon, which was a claim Mara had learned not to dispute on the grounds that it was functionally accurate. She held George the rabbit under one arm and held Mara's hand with the other and talked without pause about a dream she had had involving a purple elephant who could speak French and a small boat made entirely of cheese. He was there when they came out of the building, not waiting directly outside, not in the way that would have announced itself to Lily or created any awkwardness. He was standing half a block down the street, leaning against the building wall with his hands in his pockets, looking at his phone with the quality of inattentiveness that she now knew was actually its opposite. He looked up when they came out, and she looked at him, and Lily looked at him. And there was a moment before Lily remembered who he was, during which she studied him with her full 4-year-old forensic attention. Then, it's the tall man. "Good morning, Lily," he said. She considered him. "You're wetter than before. It rained last night. We jumped in puddles." Lily offered this as essential contextual information, which in her framework it was. "I know," he said. "I saw." Lily looked at her mother with the expression she wore when she was verifying that a social situation was proceeding according to the rules she understood. "Can he walk with us?" she asked. Mara looked at Roman. He was looking back at her with that expression. She had no word for the one she was beginning to think she would spend considerable time learning. The vocabulary of, "Yes," she said. "He can walk with us." He fell into step on Lily's other side, and they walked the 3 blocks to Mrs. Huang's in the cold morning air with Lily in the middle, still talking about the French-speaking elephant, and Mara realized at the second intersection that she was not looking at the street the way she always looked at it. She was just walking. She was just a woman walking her daughter to daycare on a clear October morning, with the smell of wet leaves and coffee and the ordinary noise of the city around her, and nothing in the air required her attention except the little girl in the red coat describing an increasingly elaborate cheese-based nautical adventure. She tucked the sensation away carefully, the way you tuck away things you're afraid to look at too directly in case they change. At Mrs. Huang's, Lily submitted to being kissed on the top of her head, pressed George the rabbit at Roman without explanation in a gesture that appeared to be an offering rather than an abandonment, and disappeared through the door with the purposeful energy of a child who had places to be. Roman stood holding the rabbit for a moment with an expression on his face that she wished she could keep, the very brief, completely unguarded quality of it, the slight widening of whatever part of him he kept most closed. "She'll want him back at pickup," Mara said. "I assumed." He looked at the rabbit, then at her. "I'll return him." She looked at him, looking at George. "You're going to carry that rabbit around for 6 hours?" "Apparently." She started laughing. It came out before she had decided to let it, a real laugh, startled out of her by the image of this particular man in this particular coat, standing on a daycare sidewalk, holding a stuffed rabbit named George, and she put her hand over her mouth too late to stop it. He looked at her while she laughed, and that expression was back on his face, the one she kept trying to name, except it was clearer now, more visible, because Lily wasn't there to redirect his attention. "Don't," she said, still laughing slightly. "Put that in a pocket. He doesn't like the dark. He's a stuffed rabbit. Tell that to Lily." He looked at George for a moment. Then he tucked the rabbit carefully into the crook of his arm, against his coat, in a way that involved the smallest possible adjustment to his usual bearing, but which accomplished its stated purpose perfectly. She watched him do it and thought about the concession of it, the complete absence of self-consciousness, the willingness to be this specific version of himself on a daycare sidewalk, because a 4-year-old had handed him a rabbit and the situation called for it. She thought, "I could fall in love with this man." And then, because she had promised herself honesty in the dark even when it was inconvenient, she amended it. "I am already most of the way there." She walked to the diner. He walked with her. They talked. And the talking was like the conversation the night before, natural in a way that she was learning to stop being surprised by, the particular ease of 2 people who had been communicating in high-stakes conditions for long enough that ordinary conversation felt like relief. He asked about Mrs. Huang. She told him about the daycare, the other children Lily had befriended, the boy named Jackson of the paint spill incident, whose mother had become someone Mara had cautious coffee with once a week. He listened and asked the occasional question, and she registered, again, the quality of his listening total, without the half-present drift that constituted most people's attention. At the diner entrance, she stopped. "I have to go in," she said. "I know." She looked at him. He was holding George with the complete equanimity of a man who had decided that what was required of him today required it, and the picture of that, the dark coat, the winter gray eyes, the 4-year-old's rabbit, would stay with her for a long time. "Come to the apartment tonight," she said. "For dinner." A pause, smaller than his pauses usually were. "Yes," he said. She went inside. Gloria looked up from the counter when she came in, took one look at her face, and said nothing for approximately 30 seconds. Then, "Different," she said. "What?" "You look different." Gloria returned to her inventory sheets. "That's all." Mara tied her apron and didn't respond. But she was smiling when she turned away, and she didn't try to stop it. The weeks that followed had the quality of something being carefully constructed. Not rushed, she would not have tolerated rushed, and he seemed to understand this without being told, seemed in fact to share the instinct, as if both of them had arrived at this point from a direction that had taught them the value of things that were built slowly enough to hold weight. He came to dinner that first evening, and they ate at the small table with Lily between them, and Lily told him about Mrs. Huang's cat, a large, opinionated tabby named Chancellor, who allowed exactly one child per day the privilege of scratching his ears, and Lily had been chosen 3 Tuesdays running, which she reported with the satisfaction of someone who has been recognized by a discriminating authority. Roman listened to this with complete attention and asked, at the end, whether Chancellor had preferences about the location of the scratching, which was exactly the right question, and Lily spent 4 minutes elaborating on the cat's specific positional requirements while Roman nodded, as if receiving a briefing on something consequential, which in Lily's world it was. Mara watched this from across the table and felt something settle in her chest that she had not known was unsettled. He came for dinner twice the following week, and once the week after, and somewhere in the course of those evenings a rhythm established itself that was too consistent to be accidental, but too organically arrived at to have been planned. He brought things, not expensive things, not the kind of gifts that announced themselves as gifts. A book he thought she might want. A specific kind of tea she had mentioned once in passing, mentioned and moved on and not expected him to register. He remembered the graphic design. He said it once, at the end of a dinner, without elaborating. "You should sketch again." She did not respond immediately. But the following week, she bought a sketchbook. She did not tell him. 2 weeks later, the sketchbook had 12 pages in it, and she had started doing what she had done before: small logo concepts, lettering studies, the quiet pleasure of form and line. She did not tell him about this either. She just let it exist. But the evening he came for dinner a month after the night of the text message, she had left the sketchbook on the table, open to a page she'd been working on. He sat at the table while she finished in the kitchen, and when she came back he was looking at the page with the same total attention he brought to everything. He didn't say anything about it. He just looked at her when she sat down, and the quality of his gaze in that moment was not the impersonal assessment of the first night, not the briefing calibration expression, not even the near warmth of the kitchen conversations. It was something fuller, something she would take a long time to name precisely, but which she would eventually understand was the look of a man who was watching someone he cares about return to themselves, and who finds that, against every expectation, it is one of the most significant things he has ever witnessed. November came. The cold became serious. The kind of cold that required Rayoul coats and Lily's dragon hood pulled tight and hot chocolate as a non-negotiable element of the after-school routine. The apartment was warmer, somehow, in November than it had been in October, though the radiator's output had not changed. She knew what had changed. She was at a point where she was done pretending she didn't. On an evening in the second week of November, after Lily was in bed and the dinner things were cleared, and they were on the couch with their respective teas, and the kind of quiet that had become the version of quiet she trusted most, she said, "I want to talk about what this is." He looked at her. "All right. I'm not asking for a definition," she said. "I'm not interested in labeling things in ways that make them feel smaller than they are." She looked at the steam rising from her mug. "I'm asking whether you're in this. Whether this is," she paused, "the direction you're moving in. Because I need to know before I go further." He was quiet for a moment. She did not rush it. "I'm in this," he said. It came out with the same quality as everything he said that mattered, stripped down, without decoration, carrying its entire weight in the plainness of it. "I have been since the night you called. I'm aware that that's," he paused, "early, relative to where we are." "It's not that early," she said. 6 weeks of near-daily conversation. More hours than I've spent talking to most people in the last year. She looked at him. "It's not the timeline. It's whether you understand what comes with it." He held her gaze. "A daughter who will be at the center of everything, always. A woman who has been hurt in specific ways that mean trust is not something that can be borrowed or assumed. A life that looks nothing like what I've built and requires a version of me that I've never fully examined." He paused. "A particular rabbit who apparently dislikes the dark." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, all of that." "I understand it," he said. "I want it. You want a second-hand couch and a coupon organizer and a 4-year-old who will tell you exactly what she observes about you with no filter whatsoever. I want you, he said. The rest is the world you live in. I want the world you live in. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she reached across the cushion between them and took his hand. He looked down at her hand in his, a small thing, such an ordinary thing, and something crossed his face that she had not seen there before. Not the fractional shift, not the near warmth, not any of the controlled expressions she had been learning to read. Something completely undefended. Something that arrived from beneath all the architecture and simply existed there, briefly, in the lamplight. She thought, this is what he looks like when no one is watching. She thought, he's letting me watch. Okay, she said quietly. Okay, he said. She did not think about the complications that night. She thought about them plenty in the days that followed, the pragmatic realities of what it meant to let this man into her life and Lily's life. The questions she still had about the specific shape of what he did and what she could and couldn't live with. The long work of building the kind of trust that the history she carried made so deliberately difficult. There was nothing simple about any of it, and she did not pretend otherwise. But there was also this. He came to the apartment the following Saturday morning with coffee and a brown paper bag and a copy of a book on the history of graphic design that she hadn't mentioned, but that was somehow exactly right. He sat on the floor and built a train track with Lily for 45 minutes with the focused patience of a man who did not do things halfway. And Lily narrated every engineering decision in detail. And he followed the narration seriously, and when she made a structural choice he thought was suboptimal, he said so, and explained why, and Lily considered his argument and revised her plan. And the whole exchange had the quality of two people taking each other seriously in the way that children, specifically, know immediately whether they are being taken seriously or only performed at. When the track was complete, Lily sat back and looked at it with satisfaction. Then she looked at Roman. You're good at trains, she informed him. Thank you, he said. You can come back and do them again. He looked at Mara across the train track with that expression. She was finally finding words for something between recognition and arrival. The specific look of a man who has walked a long distance and has found himself somewhere he did not expect, but which turns out, beyond all prior calculation, to be the right place. Yes, he said. I'll come back. Lily accepted this with the nod of someone who has rendered a verdict and moved on. She picked up George and took the rabbit to show him the train track from a ground-level perspective, holding him at track height and narrating the tour. And Roman looked at Mara, and she looked at him, and there was a moment of shared, quiet knowledge that passed between them without requiring language, the understanding that something had been decided, not in the dramatic, declarative way of things that announce themselves, but in the quiet, irreversible way of things that simply become true and stay that way. In December, he showed her the maps. It was a Sunday afternoon, Lily asleep in the back of the car on the drive over. She slept in cars with the ease of someone who had done a lot of moving through the world in them, had learned early that they were safe containers for unconsciousness, and when they arrived at his building, which was not the kind of building she had imagined, but was quieter, more spare, less a fortress than she had expected, he carried Lily upstairs still sleeping and laid her on a guest bed with George beside her, and then took Mara into the study. The maps were extraordinary. She stood in front of them for a long time, moving slowly along the wall where they were displayed under glass, tracing with her eyes the streets of cities in other centuries. Paris in 1740, London in 1840. A city she didn't immediately recognize that turned out to be the city 130 years ago, barely recognizable under the weight of all the growth. He stood behind her and said nothing, just let her look, which was she was learning the specific form of his generosity. Not explaining, not performing knowledge, just making space for her to experience the thing. Herself. The ones that stayed, she said, still looking at the old map of their city. You can see them. Yes. The main roads. The waterway. The bones of the shape. She traced a street with her finger through the glass. Everything else changed around them. The city changes, but the structure holds, he said. Or some of it does. The parts that were built for something fundamental. A pause. I've always found that worth thinking about. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the map, and she understood, standing in this room with his collection of structural persistence, thinking about a man who had built an empire partly as armor against a grief he had never fully processed, and who had answered a wrong number and come to an apartment with a leaky radiator Instead, she understood something about what this was to him. The recognition of a structure that held, something that existed underneath the change and kept holding. She put her hand on his arm. He looked at her. "Thank you for showing me this," she said. He covered her hand with his. "Thank you for being here to show." Lily woke up wanting hot chocolate and chancellor-level information about Roman's apartment, and they spent the remaining hour of the afternoon in a tour narrated entirely by a 4-year-old, and it was one of the better hours that apartment had contained. 3 months after the night of the wrong number, on a Saturday morning in January when the cold was honest about itself and the light came in low and golden through the kitchen window, Mara was making breakfast and Lily was at the table drawing and Roman was sitting across from her with the newspaper and the coffee. She had started keeping the kind he drank. And she had registered that moment the first time she reached for it automatically, had held the container and acknowledged to herself what it meant, and then made the coffee, and the apartment had the particular quality of ordinary life lived inside a structure that holds. She would carry this image forward with her into the years that came after. The kitchen light and the coffee and the newspaper and Lily drawing suns in her sketchbook, she had her own now, a green one, because she had announced that she was an artist like her mother, and the warmth of the radiator doing its small irregular sounds, and the specific sense of being in the right place at the right time, which she had not been able to trust for so long that its return felt nearly miraculous. She had not become reckless. She was still careful. She still checked the locks, still paid attention to the street, still maintained the habits of vigilance that she had built over years. You do not undo those things just because the immediate threat is gone. They have become part of your architecture, part of the way your attention moves through the world, and they will be there for a long time, perhaps always, in some form. She had made her peace with that. But the fear had changed. The specific, exhausting fear of being hunted, of being the only person standing between her daughter and something that intended harm, that was gone. In its place was something she was still learning the dimensions of, something that involved allowing, which she had been told she only needed to do, and which turned out, in practice, to be harder and also more extraordinary than she had anticipated. Lily looked up from her drawing. She had been doing this lately, looking up at the two of them with the unself-conscious evaluation of a child who is determining whether the world is arranged correctly. "Roman," she said. He looked up from the newspaper. "You live here now," she said. It was not a question. It was an observation rendered as a verdict, with the calm authority that 4-year-olds bring to pronouncements about the nature of reality. Mara turned from the stove. Roman looked at Lily for a moment. Then he looked at Mara with the question in his eyes, not asking permission, not quite, but asking, "Is this true? Is this what we're calling this?" She looked back at him across the small kitchen of the apartment on Crane Street, with its coupon organizer and its fruit magnet refrigerator and its drawings of enormous orange suns and its leaky radiator and its 2-burner stove, and she thought about what she wanted the answer to be. She thought about a woman she had been, 14 months ago, strapping her daughter into a car seat in the dark and driving until she found a bus station. She thought about the sketchbooks she had abandoned. She thought about a pamphlet in a shelter waiting room and the specific grief of recognizing your own life in its paragraphs. She thought about 7 months of rebuilding something small but hers, and the 3 words she had whispered in a dark bathroom on the night a wrong number changed everything, and a man who had answered because she said please. She thought about the bones of cities, the parts that were built for something fundamental, that held while everything else changed around them. "He does," she said. "He lives here now." Lily considered this confirmation from the authority on the matter, and found it satisfactory, and returned to her drawing. Roman set down the newspaper. He looked at Mara with the expression she had finally found the word for, the word she had been circling for weeks, trying on different approximations, and finding them insufficient. She found it now, standing at the stove with the spatula in her hand and the January light coming through the kitchen window. The word was home. He looked like a man who had arrived somewhere he had not known he was looking for and who understood, with complete clarity, that he was not going anywhere. "Okay," he said. The same word as the night on the couch. The same weight in it, the same plainness. The word that, from him, contained everything. She turned back to the stove and finished the eggs. Lily drew another sun. George the rabbit presided over the table from his position against the fruit bowl, one ear at an angle that suggested he had been placed there with deliberate ergonomic consideration. The radiator made its small sound. The light came in the window. The city did its morning things outside, going on as cities do, changing, building over itself, finding the streets that stayed and the ones that turned into something else entirely. Inside the apartment on the fourth floor of the Holloway building, an ordinary morning moved through its ordinary rhythms. Ordinary in the way that things are ordinary when they have been arrived at through extraordinary effort, when they have been chosen deliberately rather than inherited, when they have been built from the bones up by people who understood what they were building and why it had to hold. Some structures are worth the cost of building them right. This was one of them. The story of Mara Linden and the wrong number she dialed in the dark is, at its center, a story about what happens when you finally say please to the right person. Not, please save me. She was never interested in being saved, had in fact been saving herself and her daughter through 4 years of the hardest kind of daily work, the kind that doesn't look heroic from the outside because it looks like endurance, like ordinary life, like just continuing. But please stay on the line. Please be someone worth calling. Please be the thing that is different from what I've learned to expect. She had been making herself smaller for so long, taking up less space than she was owed, moving through the world with the apologetic minimalism of someone who had been taught, systematically and thoroughly, that her presence was a problem to be managed rather than a life worth its full dimensions. She had been so careful, so responsible, so determined to protect her daughter at whatever cost to herself that she had nearly forgotten the person who used to fill sketchbooks and dream about the future in a way that wasn't entirely about survival. The wrong number gave her back to herself. Not because Roman Valcourt arrived and fixed what was broken. She was not broken, and the people who thought she needed fixing had consistently been the problem rather than the solution. But because he arrived and saw what was actually there. Because he looked at the woman in the fourth-floor apartment with the coupon organizer and the fruit magnet refrigerator and the 4-year-old who talked to her rabbit and the 7 months of hard-won invisible life, and he registered it with the complete, unperforming attention of someone who understood value when he encountered it, who had spent enough time in rooms full of things that were expensive and empty to recognize something that was neither. He saw her. Before he decided what to do about anything, he saw her. And in the specific context of her history, in the context of years spent being not seen by someone who had looked at her every day, that act of seeing was its own form of rescue, quieter and more lasting than anything that could be accomplished through manpower or resources or the particular kind of authority that makes Derek Sables step away from the doors they have been testing. And she saw him. That matters, too, the fact of being known, of having someone look past the architecture of control and power and see the man who carried his grief in the careful maintenance of that control, who had built an empire partly as a monument to a loss he hadn't been able to prevent, who had answered a wrong number because some part of him recognized the shape of what he was hearing before his conscious mind had finished processing it. She saw all of it. She chose it anyway, not in spite of the complications, not ignoring the weight of what his world contained, but with full information, which is the only kind of choice that holds. Lily is 5 now. She has moved up a rabbit. There are 2. George has been joined by a companion named Admiral, whose appointment to the position was conducted with all the ceremony a 5-year-old can produce. She draws every day, because drawing is something she and her mother do together at the kitchen table, and because Roman comes home and looks at what they've made with the same total attention he brings to everything that matters to him. And being seen like that is formative, whether you're 5 or 29 or 38 or any age at all. She asks, sometimes, the questions that children ask about the shape of the world they live in. Why does Roman know so many people? Why do the people at the building say his name like that? Children are not as easy to manage as adults on these questions. They don't accept deflection as gracefully. They come back to the things they haven't gotten full answers on. They apply their developing logic to the gaps. Mara answers honestly, in the age-appropriate way of a woman who has decided that pretending the world is only its best version is not the education she wants to give her daughter. She tells her that Roman is very important to certain people in this city, and that being important to those people carries responsibilities that are different from ordinary responsibilities, and that he takes those responsibilities seriously because he is the kind of person who takes things seriously. Lily considers this and then says, like you. Yes, Mara says. Like me. She starts her graphic design courses in February. Not community college this time, a proper program. The kind she had circled and set aside and circled again over the years whenever she let herself look at what she actually wanted. She goes twice a week while Lily is at Mrs. Huang's, and Roman rearranges whatever needs to be rearranged to be available for pickup. She comes home with the particular aliveness of someone who has been doing the thing they were made to do, slightly distracted, slightly lit from the inside, turning a problem over in her mind. He watches her come in on those evenings with the expression she stopped trying to find other names for months ago. He asks what she's working on, and he listens to the full answer, and he asks the question that follows from it. And she thinks every time about all the years she spent making herself smaller. She is not making herself smaller anymore. On a Tuesday evening in March, Mara is at the kitchen table with her sketchbook, and Lily is asleep, and Roman is in the chair across from her reading, and the lamp is on, and the radiator is making its sound, and outside the window the city is doing what cities do, changing, building over itself, and she looks up, and he is already looking at her, the way he often is when she looks up, as if the looking precedes the noticing of the looking, as if the attention has been there before she turned to find it. She thinks about a bathroom wall in October. The lowest brightness setting on a phone screen. 3 words whispered into the dark. He's outside my door. She thinks about what came after. The voice that said yes instead of hello. The absolute, unhurried calm of it. The way it had been, even in that first moment, fundamentally different from anything she had learned to expect. The answer to a call she hadn't meant to make. Some calls go to exactly the right place. She looks at her daughter sleeping down the hall, in the room with the sun drawing above the bed and the 2 rabbits on the shelf and the safety that Mara built for her with both hands and everything she had, and then, when she needed it, allowed someone else to help her finish building. She looks at the man across the table who came when she called and who stayed, who is reading quietly in the lamplight with the ease of someone who has learned what comfort feels like after a long time of not knowing, who will carry George the rabbit in the crook of his arm on a daycare sidewalk without a single moment of self-consciousness, who said because you said please in a voice stripped of everything it didn't need. She looks at the sketchbook open in front of her, at the work her hands have been doing, while her life remembered its own dimensions. She thinks, this is what it looks like when broken things are not repaired but rebuilt, when the structure that holds is not the original one, which was never sound, but something built with better materials and better knowledge and the specific wisdom of people who have learned, at some cost, what foundations are actually for. She picks up the pencil. She draws the January light coming through the kitchen window. She draws the fruit magnet refrigerator with its archive of suns. She draws a tall man in a dark coat holding a rabbit in the crook of his arm on a city sidewalk, his face turned slightly toward the light. She draws what the morning looks like when you have finally stopped running, when the thing behind you is gone and the thing ahead of you is something you chose with full information and both eyes open, when the world is the size it should always have been, not small, not compressed, not the survivable minimum, but full. Room for 2 rabbits. Room for sketchbooks and design courses and ordinary Tuesday evenings. Room for a child who draws enormous suns and speaks to her stuffed animals and observes the world with an accuracy that her mother recognizes with pride and a particular grateful ache. Room for a man who answered. Room for everything that came after please. There was an evening in February, 6 weeks after Lily had declared Roman a permanent resident of the apartment on Crane Street, when everything almost came apart. Not because of Derek. Derek was gone, thoroughly and irreversibly, in the way that things ended when Roman Valcourt decided they were ending. Not because of Dean or any residual complication from the world Roman had partially stepped back from but had not entirely vacated. It came apart, almost, because of something smaller and more fundamental than any of that. It came apart because of an ordinary Tuesday, and what ordinary Tuesdays reveal about people when the adrenaline is gone and the threat has been removed, and all that remains is the daily work of being 2 specific humans attempting to build a life in the same space. He came home late. That was the beginning of it. Not dangerous late. Not the kind of late that would have sent Mara's old threat assessment instincts into motion, but later than he had said, later than she had been quietly counting on, because she had made the pasta he mentioned once in passing that he liked, and she had been trying not to notice that she was making it deliberately, and then she had noticed, and she had decided to be honest with herself about it. And then the pasta had been sitting on the stove for 40 minutes getting cold, and Lily had eaten her portion and gone to bed, And when the key turned in the lock, Mara was at the kitchen table with a glass of water and a specific quality of stillness that he recognized immediately as something requiring attention. He came in. He looked at the stove. He looked at her. "I should have called," he said. "Yes," she said. Simple. Direct. Without the cushioning she had spent years adding to every difficult thing she had to say. The softening of edges that had been trained into her by years of living with someone who responded to unpadded honesty with something she had needed to protect herself from. He sat down at the table. He did not deflect or justify or produce the particular variety of explanation that was designed to move the conversation away from his accountability and toward hers. He just sat down and looked at her and said, "I'm sorry. I was in a meeting that ran long, and I chose not to interrupt it. I should have." She looked at him across the table. This was the moment she had known when she sat down to wait. That would tell her something. Not about whether he was capable of being late, everyone was capable of being late, but about what happened next. Whether he would stay in the discomfort of having gotten something wrong, or whether the discomfort would produce some form of management, some maneuver to make the conversation go somewhere more comfortable for him. He stayed in it. "It mattered to you," he said, looking at the stove and then at her. "The dinner. And I treated it like it didn't by not calling." "It's not about the dinner," she said. And then, because she had promised herself honesty even when it was inconvenient, "It's about whether I can count on you. Whether what you say about prioritizing Lily, this apartment is the actual order of things, or whether it's the order of things when it's not inconvenient." He was quiet. She let him be quiet because she had learned that his silences were working silences, and rushing them produced worse results than waiting. "That's a fair question," he said. "And the honest answer is that I don't know yet. Not with certainty. I know what I intend. I know that my intentions have already changed what I do with my days in ways that would have been inconceivable to me a year ago." He held her gaze. "I know that I sat in that meeting for 20 minutes after it ran past the time I told you, and I was thinking about this apartment and the pasta and you at that table and Lily asleep, and I still didn't leave, and I need to understand why before I promise you it won't happen again." She looked at him. "Why didn't you leave?" "Because I've been running things by being the person who stays until things are resolved. Because leaving in the middle of something has always meant a specific category of failure in the framework I've operated inside for 20 years. He paused. "And because it's harder to change the reflex than the intention. The intention changed the night I met you. The reflex takes longer." Mara looked at this man at her kitchen table, who had just told her the truth about a limitation rather than managing her away from it. And she thought about the years she had spent with someone who answered every difficult question with a version of the question being wrong, who had made her feel that the problem was always her perception rather than the reality she was perceiving. "I know the reflex takes longer," she said. "I have my own. I still check the locks twice every night, even though you've told me the building is covered. I still run the threat assessment every time I turn a corner onto a new street." She looked at her water glass. "I'm not asking you to be finished changing. I'm asking you to keep going." "I will," he said. And then, "I should have called." "Yes," she said again, but differently this time. She reheated the pasta. They ate at midnight, the apartment quiet around them, Lily asleep, the radiator making its small sounds. He told her about the meeting not to justify the lateness, but because she had said she wanted to be let in, wanted to see what she was moving toward, and he had taken that seriously in the way he took everything she told him. She listened and asked the question that followed from what he said, and he answered it, and the conversation moved through the complications of his world with the particular honesty that had become the texture of their evenings. Later, she would understand that this was the night she stopped waiting for it to go wrong. Not because it had been a perfect evening, it had, in fact, been a difficult one, a real one, the kind that asked something of both of them, but because of how they had moved through it, the staying in the discomfort, the honesty that didn't flinch, the willingness to sit at a midnight kitchen table with cold pasta and a hard question and see it through to something better on the other side. She had been waiting, without fully admitting it, for the version of him that would eventually appear and confirm her oldest fear that the people who seemed different were only different until the pressure changed. That warmth was performance and protection was transaction, and eventually the world resolved back into the shape she already knew. It did not resolve back. It held. He held. Some structures are worth the cost of building them right. She had said this to herself before. She said it again now, at the midnight kitchen table, watching him wash the pasta pan in the way he had started doing automatically, the way people do things automatically when they have been in a space long enough for it to become the natural extension of their hands. This was one of them. She picked up the sketchbook from the counter. She drew the pasta pan in the drying rack. She drew the kitchen light at midnight. She drew the specific angle of his hands. She kept the sketch. She keeps it still. Thank you so much for staying until the end. If this story stayed with you, the videos on your screen right now were made for you. I think you'll love them. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.